Welcome to our next video, which will provide some helpful background information about 1st and 2nd Kings, which is a major reversal in the story of the Bible as God's people move from blessing and prosperity to destruction and exile. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these foundational chapters. So let's get started. And so I just want to kind of highlight some themes for reflection. This kind of brings everything together to this point as I was kind of looking at the story that we're reading today and thinking about, how do we bring this into kind of some key themes in the story? And so as we reflect on the story of the Bible to this point, God formed a new people by the faith of Abraham. So God's people, they form by faith in God through his work of transformation so that they bless the world. And really you see that demonstrated by Abraham's faith, Jacob's transformation, and then the blessing that's through Joseph. So as we look at what we're learning from the Old Testament, really Genesis is helping us see what does it mean to form into a community of faith? How does that beginning kind of formation start? Well, it requires faith, it requires transformation, and it's for the purpose of blessing. And now, as we continue in the story, the world opposed God, and so God's people should expect that they will face evil, but God delivers his people like he did with Moses. And so God sent Moses to deliver and mold his people to become a nation and represent him to the world. And so representing God is really what we learn from Moses in Exodus, that God wants us, even in an evil world, to be a people where the world encounters God. And so then we move forward into the story of the prophet's history, and really that begins with Joshua and the word fulfillment. That's really what's driving the story of Joshua and really their journey forward. It's God's purpose for them. They're moving forward. You see a lot of movement, stepping forward, maybe some stumbling, maybe some falling at time, but it's always towards God's way forward. And under Joshua, this nation inherited land from which they could now fulfill God's promise of blessing to bless the world, of God blessing them to bless the world. Now, without leadership, though, they seem to fall and to fail. And so we see that in Judges. We see that with 1st and 2nd Samuel. We even see that into the Kings. But really, God's people are still his people. God remains at work. He brings his blessing to the world by a promised future king. So David really is kind of the hopeful reminder that God's going to unite his kingdom and that they're called to bring this leadership. He's really their leader at that time, but it really highlights the need for leadership to move into the future. So I want to now transition to a summary of 1st and 2nd Kings, which is really looking at the unfortunate result of ungodly leadership, which is leadership failure. And so a long list of kings will continue the story, beginning and ending in Jerusalem. So this is how the story is structured in 5 parts. And so you see the top part and the bottom part really are the bookends. The top part, the beginning, is Solomon's reign. That's the construction of the temple. That's 1 Kings 1 through 11. And then looking to the ending, that's the second exile and destruction. That's 2 Kings 18 to 25. So the center part of the story is really broken into 3 parts. And the first middle part is 1 Kings 12 through 16, leading up to the tragedy, explaining how Israel split into 2 kingdoms. And I want to take a moment to show you what that looks like. So when it talks about the southern kingdom, that's Judah, and that's really the dynasty of David's family. And then when he talks about Israel, the northern kingdom, that's the other 11 tribes. And so this is what it looks like now, is a divided kingdom. And now as we come back to the structure, after this kingdom's divided, the second middle part in the story is 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 8. And that explains how God tried to prevent corruption in descending the prophets. We looked at Elijah, we looked at Elisha.
And then we come to the third middle part of 2 Kings 9 through 18, and that explains how exile was unavoidable. It's a consequence of their sin, as everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And that should remind us of the time of the judges, which was a common repeated statement that's now repeated in Kings, which is really discouraging. And also knowing that we have this promised Messiah, we're trusting that God's remaining at work as he has to this point. And so in terms of character development, David began the story with his final words to his son, really kind of reminds us of Moses to Joshua. And he's calling, and that's what Moses did with Joshua when his life ended. And his final words to Solomon is to remain faithful and give allegiance to God alone. And again, it's reminiscent of what Moses said to Joshua, giving hope that Israel will again be faithful to fulfill God's purpose as they experienced under Joshua. That was really a good time in Israel's history. Unfortunately, that is short-lived. That hope is short-lived. While Solomon starts strong, asking for wisdom, completing the temple, and that's the place where God's presence will meet the people, yet Solomon's downfall began when he adopted the cultural practices from the other nations, ultimately resembling Pharaoh more than David when he died. And he knew better. We read in Deuteronomy 17:16-17, how God made it clear that the king was not to multiply horses, have many wives, nor was he to multiply silver and gold. Yet, according to 1 Kings 5:6, he had 40,000 stalls for horses, 300 concubines. Silver was so common. It really is unfortunate. And Solomon foreshadows how subsequent generations will continue to struggle and fall. And so let's look at those subsequent generations. This is a list of all the kings, starting with Rehoboam, who begins poorly by acting worse than his dad, being greedy for power. And so Israel split into two, or the northern kingdom called Israel, and the southern kingdom called Judah, which the capital is Jerusalem. And so he did evil in the eyes of the Lord occurs 29 times. That's such a repeated statement, but this gives you a good summary of the different kings that we're going to read about, or that we read about. Israel and Judah, the split kingdom. And then you can see that exile for Israel finishes just before 720 BC. And then on the bottom, Judah continues into their exile to Babylon. We're going to talk more about the exile the next time that we get together, as we're going to look at the weeping prophet Jeremiah and kind of his retelling of the exile. And then we'll look at some of the leaders in exile, like Daniel and Esther. And so I really want to focus today more on the kings. But looking at these successive kings, the phrase all that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, that occurs 29 times from chapter 12 until the destruction of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings 17. So that's really the defining theme in this unfortunate period. And it characterizes the kinds of kings that we read about in the dark period of Israel's history during the Judges. So it's really unfortunate to see that we're kind of going back to that. And as we look at the kings, you'll see this kind of repeated statements that are talking about whether or not they worship God alone, whether or not they rid Israel of idolatry, whether they are faithful to the covenant. And so how did they do? Well, Israel, the northern kingdom, 0 of 20 kings, fulfilled that evaluation well. In the southern kingdom, they did a little bit better, but still not great overall. But it really highlights that amidst the faithlessness of the leaders, God's still moving his story. The story doesn't end. It is just a difficult period without godly leadership. And so again, here are the kings that we're reading about. And really, when we think about some of the brighter spots, it's really in the bottom part of Judah with Hezekiah and Josiah. They really bring to light some hope. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough leadership to change the course to exile. But here we are. uh, for each king, God raised up prophets to hold them accountable. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet who lived in the desert, and he spoke against King Ahab in the north, who together with his wife Jezebel instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so just think about the story, and it reminds us way back in that moment when in Exodus, God's people were just delivered, and Moses was taking too long, and so they responded by building an idol, and how that was a real test of faith for God's people then, and it continues to be a challenge for them even through the kings, and yet they are failing here with them having over 450 prophets to Baal. Clearly, they were not seeking the Lord. And so Elijah, the prophet, comes on the scene, and he challenged over 450 prophets of Baal to demonstrate that his God, that Yahweh, was real. And so Ahab's leadership was ungodly and would fall due to the injustice. And you see that best in a story where Ahab is killing an Israelite farmer, stealing his family's vineyard. And so Ahab is one that really is living an unjust life. And Elijah passes the mantle then to a young Elisha, who played the same role of confronting Israel's kings for their idolatry and their injustice. Now, all said, when we think about the plot, the road to exile becomes unavoidable. It's starting in the north with Israel due to the idolatry, the injustice, the unfaithfulness. And then Judah in the south had some heroic kings, like I mentioned, Hezekiah and Josiah, who brought reform, brought hope, but Judah was too far gone. And with Jerusalem destroyed and the people exiled in Babylon, the story ends with a question if God was done with the line of David. And so the good news is there's a glimmer of hope, as you read at the end of 2 Kings 25, that the Babylonian king invited Jehoiakim, the king of Israel, to sit at table with him. The reader has a small glimmer of hope, but the question persists whether or not this is the end of God's people and their purpose in the world. So when you think about what to remember, really remember these two parts of the story. In 2 Kings 17, the author stops the story and offers a prophetic reflection on all that's happened so far. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And it's because of their sins that God allowed his people to face the consequence of their decisions. And so this is more than just telling history. It's to help us learn from them and to take seriously the life that we're given. And so as we get to 2 Kings 25, in the final paragraph, it actually jumps 40 years into the Babylonian exile, which we're going to focus more on in the next discussion, looking at the exile. But what we find here is this little odd story about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, he would have been king in Jerusalem. And so the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life. And so it's not much, but the story offers a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned his promise to David, the promise back in 2 Samuel 7. And it's that hope that gets explored further in the wisdom and prophetic books of the Bible that we'll start to look at next time. And even though Israel's prophets labor unsuccessfully to turn God's people from idolatry and injustice, God allows them to face the consequences of their decision. And despite Israel's exile, a hopeful remnant suggests that God has not abandoned his promise to David. So that little story at the end might have been kind of confusing to you, but it's really important to see that it speaks towards God's purpose, that he's working. And it might be hard to see, but he's definitely having the final word in 1st and 2nd Kings. And so what do we conclude from the prophets' history? Again, remember there's the Torah, the law, and the prophets. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's really the law, the Torah, and that's looking at how God's people formed as a community. Now, as we moved into the prophets' history, that was Joshua that we looked at, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We added Ruth in there because it really helped move the story. That's more part of the writings. But as we conclude the second major section of the Old Testament with the prophets' history, we learn how the law, which was given to God's people in the Torah, was not written for mechanical obedience. God wants a relationship, and he wants to lead them, and so that they would listen to him. He wants that theme of listening comes up a lot. We saw that especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel, where we saw that that Saul did not listen to God, David did, and it really represented his humility. While God was faithful to his promise, Israel remained faithless in the land they were given and repeatedly did not listen to God. So as promised, Israel was exiled. And so with the close of 2nd Kings, in contrast to Joshua, who brought them into the land, due to their disobedience, God's people were now brought out of God's promised land. And so from the beginning, the reader has looked for the wounded victor of Genesis 3, a prophet like Moses from Deuteronomy 18, but all of Israel's leaders fell short, even David. And while God continued to work through his rebellious people, obedience to the law really seems impossible. And it's demonstrating the need for God to transform the hearts of his people as promised in Deuteronomy 30. And so now with the promise of an eternal kingdom from 2 Samuel 7, the reader is left hopeful for a future blessing and now looks for God to fulfill this promise of a future messianic king.